Hey everyone. We just finished talking about how the Enlightenment influenced our founding fathers. Today we're going to be talking about other events and documents that also influenced our founding fathers. Before we get started, we need to understand some basic principles. This entire video will be based on the following 4 principles. The first is limited government. Limited government means limiting the government's power. The purpose of a limited government is to prevent the abuse of power by government. An example would be not allowing the government to take a person's property whenever it wanted. The second is self-government. Self-government means what it sounds like. It's when a group of people create their own rules and laws, or even create their own government. An example is when the British colonists created the United States of America. The third is rule of law. Rule of law means that everyone has to follow the law, even the president. No one is above the law. The fourth is due process. Due process means having fair rules and laws in the legal system. If a person is charged with a crime, they can't be deprived of their life, liberty, or property without the due process of law. An example would be that a person has a right to a trial if they are charged with a crime. To summarize, there are 4 principles that we're talking about in this video, and all 4 influenced our founding fathers. They're limited government, self-government, rule of law, and due process. The first document we'll talk about is the Magna Carta. Here's what happened. The King of England was treating his people unfairly. He would do things like take their property without paying them back or put them in jail without a trial. The wealthy nobles were upset about this. Eventually the nobles said, "We've had enough. You need to stop treating us like this or we're going to pew-pew you." Eventually the king relented. In 1215, the nobles forced the king to sign the Magna Carta. The Magna Carta forbade the king from making new taxes without the baron's consent, and a person couldn't be put in jail without a trial. Here's why the Magna Carta is important. The Magna Carta limited the king's power. For example, he couldn't put people in jail without giving them a trial, and he was no longer allowed to take their property without paying them back. This is an example of limited government because the king could no longer do whatever he wanted. Since the king had to follow the rules of the Magna Carta, just like everyone else, it's also an example of rule of law. Additionally, since the king could not put people in jail without a trial, it was also an example of due process. The next event we'll talk about is the Mayflower Compact. This is a story about the Pilgrims. On their way to North America, the Pilgrims' boats were blown off course by a storm. The Pilgrims landed in an area that wasn't governed by any rules or laws. Before coming on shore, the Pilgrims decided that they needed to make their own rules and laws to live by. The Pilgrims called it the Mayflower Compact. The Mayflower Compact was signed by 41 men. Women weren't allowed to vote at this time. The Mayflower Compact is important because it's an example of self-government. The Pilgrims created their own rules and laws for people to live by. In a few weeks, we're going to be talking about how the British colonists declared independence from Britain and created the United States of America. This is another example of self-government. The next document is the English Bill of Rights. This is like round 2 of the people versus the king. Although it was a different king this time, he was back to his old ways. Yet again, both the people and the English Parliament were upset with the king. Eventually the king was replaced and the English Bill of Rights was signed. The English Bill of Rights gave people rights like the right to bear arms, the freedom to petition the government, and no cruel or unusual punishment. This is important because it gave people rights and it also limited the government's power. Our founding fathers ensured that the United States also would have a Bill of Rights. Our Bill of Rights has many of the same rights as the English Bill of Rights, things like the right to bear arms and the freedom to petition the government. The last document we'll talk about is Thomas Paine's Common Sense. During this time, the British colonies were in open rebellion against the British government. They weren't sure if declaring independence was the best choice, so Thomas Paine wrote a small pamphlet called Common Sense. Thomas Paine wrote it was common sense to declare independence from Britain. Thomas Paine's Common Sense was persuasive because it was written in plain English so common people could understand. It persuaded many people that declaring independence was the best choice. Common sense is an example of self-government because Thomas Paine thought the colonists should create their own country, and we'll find out eventually that came true. To summarize, we've talked about the Magna Carta, Mayflower Compact, English Bill of Rights, and Common Sense. Our founding fathers relied on these documents when creating America, but really what we mean is they relied on the principles contained in these documents, principles like limited government, self-government, due process, and rule of law. In other words, our founding fathers were influenced by these documents and used the principles contained in them to create our country. Thanks, everyone. Have a good day.